Oh, hello. Welcome to MBA Bar Talks, and this is the Legal Legends series. I'm Adam Johnson, and with co-host Janika White, we will be interviewing stalwarts of the Memphis legal community to get the oral history of both themselves and the city. We hope you enjoy it. Today's guest is Justice Janice Holder. Good morning, Justice Holder.
Good morning.
How are you doing today?
I am doing well.
Good. Thank you for being here today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
As with everyone, tell us a little bit about your childhood.
I grew up in, I would almost say rural western Pennsylvania, although it wasn't, it was kind of a village. I lived outside a small town of 3,000 people where everybody knew everybody. And, if you didn't do something right, they'd tell your parents. I mean, it was a very small place. And it was a great place to grow up, a very safe place to grow up, about 25 miles outside of Pittsburgh. I enjoyed it. I went back recently, and it just sort of amazed me that that's where I grew up. I told people that I used to go to high school at Fort Cherry High School, which was in the middle of fields and pastures. And I went back, and it's still exactly the same. In fields and pastures. There's no development around it. It's just this large high school in the middle of nowhere.
And it's still open?
Oh, yes. And they added a middle school to it. So it's what they called in Pennsylvania a jointure of three separate communities that got together to build that high school. So instead of having three tiny little high schools in these little places, they got together. So everybody's bused there because it's a jointure.
How often do you go back?
I'm on the board of visitors at Pitt, so I go back a couple of times a year at least, sometimes 3 times a year.
At what point did you decide you wanted to become a lawyer? Did that come later?
Very late.
Okay.
Very late in life. I was going to be a research psychologist and had applied to 4 or 5 schools around the country to go to graduate school. And Educational Testing Service forgot to send my scores to those schools, so they all rejected me. And I found out later it was because they never got my scores, so I had to sit out a year. So while I was sitting out a year, I sort of rethought my idea about becoming a research psychologist, and I applied to 1 law school, 1 paralegal school. I applied to get my teaching certificate in French because that was my minor, but was really a double major. And I applied to be a flight attendant at Pan Am. Went to New York for an interview at Pan Am, and I got accepted at all of it, and so I decided I would go to law school for a year to see if I liked it.
What made you pick law school over the other opportunity?
It looked like it was going to be the hardest thing to do, and I thought, I'll try it, and if I don't like it, no harm, no foul. I'll just go the second year.
Just go do something else.
Go do something else.
Anyone that knows you knows that you love to travel, so has that been the case basically since the beginning?
My first real international trip was when I was in college. I did a semester abroad. It was a year abroad, actually, through University of Pittsburgh, because French was my worst language and French was my worst subject. So I decided that if I was going to do something that was that painful, I was going to learn the language. So I did I lived with a family in France, and I was, immersed in the language. And I did the semester in Normandy, in Rouen. And then I went another semester at the Sorbonne. So I had 2 semesters there, spending 4 months here and 4 months there. It was really fun. That was my first. Then after that, no holds barred. Every time my parents turned around, I'd say something like, Mom, Dad, I think I'm going to go to Europe next month. And they'd say, fine, dear, what can we do to help? And I would just leave. I spent 4 months traveling after I graduated from college. This was when that gap year that I had to take. And I went sailing in the English Channel to the Scilly Isles with friends that had a boat. And I traveled all over the place, and then I ended up skiing in Val d'Isère at the end. And it was just magical.
So I assume you spent some time in Paris.
Yes, I lived in Paris when I went to the Sorbonne, and I lived on the Ile Saint-Louis, and I could watch Pompidou, who was president of France then, getting in his car from his apartment. And Sophia Loren had an apartment on the Ile Saint-Louis. And so I could just watch all this stuff going on. It was really fun.
What was your favorite way to spend time there?
I used to walk through the Louvre every day after class. I would come from the Sorbonne and walk through the Louvre for an hour, because you can only take it in tiny bits anyway. And every day I'd walk, because if you were a student, you got in for free. So you just walked in, and I'd take a little part of the museum and go through it, and then the next day I'd take another little part of the museum and go through it. And that's how I did my summer there.
Did you ever end up with a favorite?
No, it was just, well, of course you could see the Mona Lisa. Back
Right.
then, you walked right up to it. There was the Mona Lisa.
So fascinating.
And this was in the 70s?
Yeah, that was 1970 and 71.
At
Then
that-
the big trip, when I was doing I was studying in 70, 71, and then the big trip was 74. 71 was when I graduated. And so when I had to take the gap year, that was the travel year, and the 1970 was when I was there officially as a student.
Did you notice any major differences between Parisians and Americans?
Oh, definitely. I mean, you could spot an American walking down the street. It was the way people looked at each other. You know, we as Americans are very accustomed to looking at people. You know, I've come to go down the street and I look at you. Mm-hmm. You don't do that. You didn't do that in France because it was an invitation. So you learn to look through somebody while seeing them. So you look kind of past them while you were seeing them. That was official fun. And I used to rescue young women, students, who had people following them for no other reason than they looked at the people as they were passing. And back then, the only people who wore blue jeans were Americans. It changed. And then the French got blue jeans, but they tailored them and did all kinds of wonderful things with them.
Wonderful things.
But if you saw somebody in blue jeans, they were American.
And so how did that experience change or shape you once you came back home?
I think it made me more aware of fashion. Not that I'm a fashionista, because I'm not. But
You have good fashion now, Justice Holder,
thank you.
for
Thank you.
sure.
But I used to watch the French women walking down the street, and they were all very well put together. And it wasn't because they had closets full of clothing. The quality of their clothing was so good that they could take one skirt and make it look 5 different ways, or their outfits. The quality of what they were wearing just translated and made them look so put together. That was something that I really took home with me, was the quality of the look that you put together.
Shifting gears a little bit, you clerked for a federal judge
I
in
did.
Western Pennsylvania. Was that, I assume, right after law school?
Yes. There were only 2 federal judges in the Western District of Pennsylvania that would hire women. He was one of them. And I applied to work for him, and he had a 2-year program. You were a junior law clerk the first year, senior law clerk the second year. And I worked for him for 2 years.
How did that, if at all, affect how...
I wanted his job. I wanted his job, yeah. That's when I realized I wanted to be a judge. And we did some fascinating things. He took senior judge status quickly, and so he was offered the opportunity to go to Phoenix to try a lawsuit there with F. Lee Bailey as the defendant's attorney in a criminal. And so we were there for about a month, I think, and we tried this lawsuit, and it was a criminal case, and Bailey got a directed verdict at the close of the prosecution's proof. Yeah, it was amazing. We walked out after the proof, and the judge looked at me and he said, "What do you think?" I said, "They didn't prove their case." I said, "They didn't do anything." And he said, "You're right." And so when the verdict, the motion is always going to come, motion to dismiss. So when that motion came, the judges simply granted it. And I saw Bailey about a few years before he died, so 2-3 years before he died. And I said, "You won't remember me, but I was Judge Sorg's law clerk when you tried the case, when you were defending the case against Peter McDonald, chief of the Navajo Nation." And he said, "Oh, I remember him." And he went on and he told me a version of the story that wasn't my version of the story, let me put it that way, about how the case got dismissed. And it was like, okay, I hear you. It's not the way it happened, but I hear you. Yeah.
More embellished?
Yes, very much so.
And then from there, you moved to Memphis in
Yes.
79?
I practiced law. I got a job with a small law firm for a couple of years. I took over for a person who became a federal judge. And I was handed this lawsuit to try, and so I tried it. My first trial ever, anywhere, was a labor law case in federal district court that was tried to a jury for a week. I was the only lawyer in the room for the plaintiff. I tried it by myself, and that was my first lawsuit ever.
Were there any women in the room?
There were more women there in Pittsburgh than there were in Memphis when I got there. But there were women in Pittsburgh. They were very visible
Okay.
because there weren't that many women there. But most of the barriers, the initial barriers were gone in Pittsburgh.
And then you moved to Memphis.
Then I moved to Memphis.
And what was that transition like?
It's like going into the dark ages. It was very different. I was very Yankee, and it wasn't a welcoming environment, to say the least.
What brought you to Memphis initially?
I was married to a lawyer who got a job offer with Young and Pearl, so we came for that job, and then I started looking for a job, which was an interesting experience. I will tell this story because he's told this story, but I went into a law firm, and it was very nice. I mean, the partners, I got an interview because somebody knew them, and they just let me come in. So I was talking to the partner, and he said, another partner came in and said, well, do you plan to have a family? And I said, well, I'm happy to answer that, but you probably just violated Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. The Yankee in me said that,
Yeah.
And he said, you mean I can't ask that? I said, well, it depends on how many employees you have. And so I get home, and I was home, and the phone started ringing, and they offered me a job.
Of course they did.
So we went for a while, and, I would make the secretaries cry because I was this Yankee who, I think they really didn't want me there. So they cried to see if they could get me out of there. The women couldn't eat lunch with the men, go out with the men because it wouldn't look good. So there was one other woman in the law firm who was the daughter of one of the people who was partner. So I ate lunch with the secretaries, who I made cry. Right? I ate lunch with the secretaries, and we were all in this room together once because you could eat everybody could eat together in the conference room. You just couldn't go out together. So the whole room was full, and one of the lawyers came in and started talking about the damn Arabs, and it went on and on and on. And finally, I said, part of my background is that my grandparents came from Syria. There was this dead silence. So we get through lunch, and I came out, and I was talking to one of my friends who, there were people I could talk to there. And I said, what do I do now? What did I do this time? And he said, Janice, you were hired because you were Jewish. I said, really? He said, yes, that's why you were hired. That's what the partner says of you is that you're Jewish. So, it ends up, I won't tell you the end of the story, but it turned out pretty funny. But I saw him later at a memorial service for a friend who was Jewish. And he came up to me and he said, do you remember when I hired you because you were Jewish? I said, yes, I do remember that. It was a very interesting time in my life.
So broadening it a little bit, what was Memphis as a whole like back then as a city?
I thought it had a very interesting and sort of vibrant bar. I liked, there were characters, and there were good lawyers, and I thought that it was one of those places that had a good bar that worked well together. And you could rely on people's word. And those people whose word you couldn't rely on, everybody knew who they were.
Around that time, how many other women lawyers were there?
There were, and I looked this up, in 1980, 4.73% of the lawyers in the state were women. And in Shelby County, 4.38% were women. So if you were a woman in Shelby County, everybody knew who you were. You knew each other because it was a very small group of people.
And what was it like practicing, in that atmosphere?
It was very different than Pittsburgh because it really wasn't very welcoming to women. I told you my experience that my first trial was in federal court by myself in a jury trial. The partners of the firm that I was with didn't think their clients would like it if they were represented by a woman. So they weren't going to send me anywhere. I did get to sit second chair in some trials, but they weren't going to give me any responsibility for a trial largely because they didn't think it would be acceptable.
And so how long did you stay there?
2.5 years.
And where did you go after that?
I went out on my own for a little while, and then I went with Dice, Burson, and Holder. So that's when I was with Paul Burson and John Dice for another short period of time, and then I went from there to ultimately went just before I ran for office. I went out on my own again, and I was in the Morgan Keegan Tower in their executive suites just before I decided to run.
What kind of cases were you handling?
It was a little bit of everything, but toward the end, I'd say I was primarily a domestic relations attorney. Although I started out doing things like aviation law. I got hired at my original law firm because of my aviation background and worked on 2 aviation cases. That's what I was hired to do.
I don't think we've talked about your aviation background. Tell us about that.
But I had, there were 2 cases, and when I got hired originally, despite the fact that I wasn't Jewish and they thought I was. I got hired because when I was a law clerk, I had experience working on aviation issues. So there was a Cessna 150 case, and there was I think it was a Piper products liability case. The Cessna 150 was a midair collision. It's that, I don't know if you've heard of it, it's sort of famous midair collision in the Memphis area. And so I was hired to work on both of those cases, and they were plaintiff's cases. When those were finished, then I got switched over to the defense side, which I had never done, which was a different world and something I didn't really understand that well, and wasn't very well explained to me. So that's where the breakdown started to occur, I would say.
And it had nothing to do with your TWA experience.
Pan Am.
Or Pan Am, I'm sorry. Pan Am experience.
Yes. They called me for the first year that I was in law school. They called me every few months to see if I was finished with law school and was ready to come to work for them.
So one question that I have is that it seems like you definitely don't have a problem going after the challenge. You go for the challenge, the heart. Those moments when you transitioned, how did you know that it was time for you to transition and move? And what gave you the courage to do it?
Well, I think the best example was running for office. In 1990, I just got out on my own, and it was in the Morgan Keegan Tower, and a couple of people said, "Are you going to run?" And I said, "I don't know, I don't think so." And I did ask some people. I asked some advice. I asked for some advice, and uniformly, the people that I asked said, "Don't do it. Work in somebody's campaign, learn how to do it. You don't know anybody in Memphis except the bar." Very good advice, right?
Right.
I completely ignored it.
Because you'd been here about 10 years by that point, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And they were right. I mean, they were completely right. And I don't know if you know Lauren Holloway. Lauren Holloway, because I had told her, I don't think I'm going to do it. And what she said to me was, "Well, no guts, no glory." And I sort of sat back and I thought, and there were a couple of other things that happened during that time frame when people told me stories about themselves that they didn't do something that they were supposed to do, and they look back on it now and regret not having done it. And so I said, okay, I get it. So I decided that at that point, people were already in the race. I mean, people were running and had their campaigns, and it was then January, and I said, well, I can do anything for 8 months. I just started my practice. I put it on hold. I started associating people to work on cases that I had, so that it could be sort of seamless. I mean, they could help me out as I went along if I needed it, but then if I won, then they could just take the case, okay? There wasn't any transition necessary. So I then started looking around for support to see, having decided I was going to do this, I started trying to find out who might be willing to help me. Well, as it turns out, I got two of the very, very, very best people that you could ever ask to help me, and that was Bill Gibbons and Hardy Mays. And so they put together a campaign. Hardy kind of wrote the script. I mean, he was the architect, and Bill was my campaign manager, although I had other people on paper as campaign managers who did help me out. He was truly the person who ran it. He was the person I talked to every day. And it was just one of those interesting times when things fell into place. As things went on, I got the endorsement of the commercial appeal. As things went on, I got other endorsements. I got your uncle, Reverend White was my supporter. He helped me out in more ways than you could imagine. And I had people like that in my life during those times that it just kept snowballing. And it worked. And it had no business working. I mean, I didn't know anybody in Memphis. I campaigned every day.
And I guess for the folks that are listening, for people who don't know, Hardy Mays is our federal court judge for the Western District, and then Bill Gibbons was the Shelby County District Attorney for many years.
And then Homeland Security.
Right,
yeah.
Right, and now he serves on our
Crime Commission.
So you really did.
I lucked out.
You picked an awesome two.
I really did. And it was just amazing. It was amazing how the campaign went every day. And then my mother, my secret weapon, my mother and dad they actually moved, but they came down from those months. They came down, I think, in April of that year. And then my mother started campaigning. She didn't have any political experience. Her idea was to call every holder in the phone book and ask them if they wanted a yard sign. So she called a guy, this is priceless. She called a guy named Merle Holder. Merle Holder was the president of the Barbers. And so she came home and she said, "Do you know what the AFL-CIO Labor Council is?" And I said, "Yeah, I do." And she said, "Well, Merle Holder says he's going to help you get that endorsement." I said, "Well, somebody else already has it." She said, "Merle says he's going to help." So I said, okay. So it turns out Merle's on the executive committee of the AFL-CIO Labor Council. A supporter of mine is also on the executive committee of the AFL-CIO Labor Council. They didn't like each other, but they discovered they had something in common, and that was they were supporting me. And so the endorsement that was a done deal got thrown out the window, and they opened up all of the endorsements for everyone to the whole Labor Council, and they could vote. So everybody came in one at a time and gave their spiel to this assembled group of people, and then they voted at the end.
Talk about divine alignment, right?
Merle said that he was my cousin, and he told everybody he was my cousin. So when I would go somewhere, they would say, "How's Cousin Merle?" And I'd say, "He's just great." Finally, somebody said, "Is he really your cousin?" And I said, "Merle knows the family tree far better than I do."
Perfect answer.
So I became part of the Merle Holder family. I could go across the state. I was at Boys State. And one of the American Legion gentlemen came up to me, the president, and said, "I'm going to Memphis tomorrow to see your cousin." I said, "Cousin Merle?" And he said, "Yes, Cousin Merle." And I said, "Well, tell Cousin Merle I said hello. I haven't seen him in a while, but give him my best."
Everyone knows Cousin Merle.
Everybody knows Cousin Merle.
I remember that is one of the best stories ever. And I remember when you just said, when you decided to run, it's only 8 months.
Only 8 months.
And I remember when I decided to run, you were one of the people who pushed me across that line to say, "Hey, it's only 6 months. I can do this."
Exactly.
And one of the best decisions that I ever made. And I thank you for encouraging me during that time. It means so much.
I try not to discourage people from doing things. I did something recently I wish I hadn't done about somebody who was running for something. But if someone asks me about doing something, I never want to be the person that discourages them or that is negative like the people who are negative to me, because you don't know how it's going to turn out. And do you really want to be in a position where you look back 6 years, 10 years, 20 years from now and say, "I wonder what would have happened if I had done what I wanted to do"? You don't want to be there. And it's better, you're going to learn something. You're going to learn something whether you win or lose. But what you learn, you can put to good use someplace else. So I told this story for the Pillars event, and they distilled it. And all they let in there was that my mother called all the holders in the phone book. And I won't tell you who the gentleman was, but a lawyer came up to me and he said, "You know, my cousin was someone your mother called during that time." And I said, "Cousin Merle?" And he said, "Yes, Cousin Merle."
Please tell me that you have kept in contact with Cousin Merle.
I kept in touch with the family for a long time and always sent them, one of my little Christmas cards with photos and stuff. And I found out later from his wife, Fran, that he did die. And I didn't know it. But yes, Cousin Merle was amazing.
Well, to go back a little bit, I know you mentioned you were a law partner with John Dice.
Yes.
For those that don't know, can you tell us a little bit about him?
John was an interesting person. He had a criminal practice that, and a lot of it was public defender type criminal practice. And very good lawyer, very intense, had something of a military background, and was just a really great guy. He and Paul got me to join that law firm when it was after I left. Let's see, which one was that? Right, it was, I'm getting my time frames a little bit mixed up, but it would have been 85, 86, right in there. It was definitely post-law firm. And so I was there a couple of years before John died.
Then you became kind of instrumental in pushing for the helping lawyers program.
Yes, and I'm glad I thought about this last night. I did pull something that I had written, and I didn't write it really for anybody or for publication, but I wrote it because I wanted to make it clear for the Memphis Bar Association how all of this developed from the inception of people talking about drug and alcohol issues, is really what they were talking about, to what we have right now, which is the Tennessee Lawyers
TLAP.
Assistant program.
TLAP, right, assistance program. And there is a continuum there that I think is important to understand. When John died, we realized we all had knowledge of what was going on with him. And it wasn't drug and alcohol, it was emotional, mental issues. But we all had knowledge of something, but we never put it together. We never got together and said, here's what I know, here's what you know, what can we do to make this better? And out of that was my thought that we need to have a program or a clearinghouse where we can talk about these things and where people can be encouraged to share their information to help people. So I found the history that I had done some time ago was before I got off the Supreme Court, and I was clearing out files and decided I came across all these files and I really should put it all together in a packet and give it to the Bar Association. So it exists somewhere in here, but I gave Marianne another copy. But before all of this, in '84, then President Ross Clark forwarded a memorandum to some other people in the bar, asking them to act on the initial formation of an MBA committee addressing alcohol and substance abuse problems suffered by lawyers in the Memphis area. They looked at it a little bit. They looked at what was in existence at the time, which was very few bars were doing anything. And they came back with a report. Well, the report sat there, and no one did anything with it. So in '86, after John died, and I think it was probably '87 that I did this, I contacted the Bar Association and said, can we form a committee to look at this? That's when I learned that there had been a committee in place. They had filed a report, and it didn't go any further. So from that point on, several of us who knew John met together, and we decided we wanted to form an attorney impairment committee. And the difference between what we were doing then and what others were doing is that we weren't focusing, because of John, we weren't focusing on alcohol and drugs. We were focusing on lawyer impairment. We didn't care how you were impaired or why you were impaired. If you were impaired, we wanted something to address it. And that was the beginning of the Lawyers Helping Lawyers Committee, and it was a committee of people. And while not ideal, it was a committee that would review the problems that a particular person had. We were subject to confidentiality, but it still was a little odd for us to be dealing with people directly, as opposed to a director who goes and does something, or a real program that wasn't reliant on volunteers. It was all volunteer. And from that point on, it continued for years. When I became a trial judge in 1990, that's when I transitioned out of being the chair, and Butch Childers became the chair. We were a committee of the Memphis Bar Association, but kind of the deal we had with the Memphis Bar was leave us alone. Don't try to appoint people to these committees. Don't try to tell us what to do, because we're not going to do that. So this isn't a normal committee. This is a committee we're running. And we're happy to be part of the Memphis Bar Association, but don't think you're going to change the chair every year. Don't think you're going to change all this stuff. So, and at that point in time, the Lance Bracey wrote an article on lawyer impairment and gave a speech here. We were really kind of the focus of it. I think there were some other programs across the state later. I think Chattanooga might have had one, but it was just in pockets. So when I got on the Supreme Court in 1996, one of my focuses was to see if we could get a statewide program. And I worked really hard to get that done. And in 1999, we put that together. So, but for the Lawyers Helping Lawyers Committee, I don't know how TLAP ever would have been formed or why it would have been formed, because it was not an easy sell. It was not an easy sell. I said I wanted it, and the other 4 people looked at me like, sure, great. But I got a guy from Texas who was in the Texas program to come up and to speak to us during our retreat and explain why Tennessee needed a program. And after he finished speaking, they said, well, how fast can we get this done? So it went from we're not interested to how fast can we get this done? And we literally put it on a time schedule that from that moment to the time that we actually implemented the thing was just months.
And as we sit here today, are you still involved with it?
I am not.
I know it's in good hands, but
I am not. I really haven't been involved. I was the liaison when I was on the Supreme Court. I was the liaison forever. And it has evolved into something that I'm just not part of.
well, going back to your time on the trial court level, probably get asked this a lot, but were there things lawyers did that would just make you want to pull your hair out?
No. I loved dealing with the lawyers when I was on the trial bench. I loved them. And I hope they liked me, but I loved working with trial lawyers. And they were it was the most fun I've ever had, was being a trial judge. And I joke with a good friend of mine, and we always say that might have been my highest and best use. But I loved being a trial judge and had so much fun working on cases. And I really enjoyed the kind of the mass tort stuff and the stuff you could really work with, not the one-offs, but the stuff that you really had to organize and have fun with.
And you were in Division 2 at that time?
Division 2.
It's the same courtroom that's there now, or is it a different one?
Same courtroom. It had just been built out, I want to say, just before I got there. No. It was built out already because Chuck McPherson was there, but they remodeled the courthouse, and they took out all the oak, the light oak that was there, and replaced it with mahogany, and changed the tables, the lawyers' tables, and things like that. So they were just finishing the renovation of that when I came on the bench.
Judge Childers was telling me that he would occasionally smoke cigars in the afternoon.
Everybody smoked in there,
Okay.
and in the old courtroom, before they took all that oak out, you could see where someone had put a cigar or a cigarette on the witness stand. Just left it there while they were doing something and came back to get it. Yeah, and it smelled. And Chuck smoked a lot, and everything in that room was filled with smoke. It was just smoke saturated. So when they changed it all out, it was much better.
Another big difference.
Yes. But Chuck left a lot of things for me in a big filing cabinet, and he left all the workers' compensation, asbestos cases. It was just those kinds of things that he didn't want to deal with before he retired. And then he would come into my door. He would open up the door, and he'd say, "I saw that X case is set today." And I said to myself, "Thank you, Lord, I'm not here anymore." And he'd walk out.
Is there anything you miss about being on the trial court?
Oh, I miss everything about it. I really loved it. I'm sure it's different now. I'm sure that people may act differently than they did. It was a very polite time. People were very well behaved, except for a few lawyers who were like the characters, who you always knew. You sort of sat on the edge of your chair because you never knew what they were going to do. You had to be prepared. But I did love doing it. I still get to do a little bit of trial work because when Dan Michael was elected, he had a number of conflicts. And so rather than try to get an interchange system going with, 24 or 12 or whatever it was cases, he asked the Supreme Court to help, and they asked me if I would be willing to go in there and be designated on those cases, and I'm still doing that.
You were appointed to the Tennessee Supreme Court in 1996, I think, by
Yes.
Governor Sundquist.
Yes.
What made you decide to apply for that?
It was another one of those. Actually, I applied in 1994 because I wanted to see what this was the new process, completely new process under a statute that no longer exists. But it was a new process where the governor just didn't do a direct appointment. It went through a judicial nominating commission. I wanted to see how it worked. I knew I wasn't going to be appointed because the governor kind of forgot that the new process was in place and announced his appointment before the process started. And so I knew who he was going to appoint. I just thought, why not do this? It's like a dry run. So I did it and
Got the experience.
Got the experience. And so in 1996, the person who was appointed was defeated in the retention election, which was like the first retention election. So I decided I might as well stick my name in there. So I did.
And one of the things that you were instrumental in doing on your time on the Supreme Court was the Access to Justice program. What motivated you to get that going?
That wasn't just me. That was the whole court. In 2000, I want to say 2008, could have been 2007, I think it was 2008. The court had retreats, and we had a retreat where it's a facilitated retreat with a guy named Dale Lefevre, who was wonderful. And, it led us through, what was important, what we wanted to do. It was just one of those wonderful kinds of exercises. And we decided, as a court, that access to justice was going to be the number one strategic priority in that year and in years to come. And that was a joint decision. And I just happened to be, after Mickey Barker left, I then was Chief Justice in 2008, from 2008 to 2010. So because I was Chief Justice, I was the person that led it forward. I mean, everybody was on board. But I was the person who got to lead it. And we appointed a commission, and everything was covered. We did it very strategically. Everything was covered by the media. We made it very clear what we were doing, what our progress was going to be, how we were going to proceed. We went across the state. We had sort of listening meetings across the state with people we thought were stakeholders. I mean, we really put a lot of effort into it. And then we named our commission, and the chair of our commission was Margaret Bem. And Margaret and I went to an ABA meeting, national meeting, about access to justice commissions. And we were like brand new. I mean, she had just been chair for a couple of months, and we went together and we sat there and we went to this program about how to start an access to justice initiative. And there was this big, long list of things that you should try to accomplish in your initial year. And Margaret and I sat side by side, and we took a pen and we check. We went all the way down the list, and we had both checked everything because it had already been done. And one of the things that they suggested was attempt to get one of your Supreme Court justices to be a champion for access to justice. And we kind of looked at each other. I mean, it's our whole court. I mean, there's no pushback. It's the whole court. So it was a very interesting process, and we did things differently. We didn't assemble people from all of the legal services corporations, the representatives. We didn't get Mal's and LAT and all the people together and get those people on our board. We got people from the community on our board. We got pastors. We got corporate people, we got lawyers, we got people who were in the community. And then on our subcommittees, we got our normal access to justice people. But what we wanted was a perspective of the people in the community as to how we can move these things forward. And we needed their input, and we needed their push, and we needed their contacts to really make it an appropriate vehicle. And that's how the Faith and Justice Initiative started, was through having pastors involved, having people who had connections. It's how we had programs in churches. We did things in a way that was really thinking outside the box for this type of endeavor. So I was very proud to be part of it, but it really wasn't me. I mean, it was the whole court that was behind it.
I was just going to say, it's just so amazing to hear just how thoughtful and innovative you've been in so many different places. Everywhere you go and everywhere you've been, you leave it so much better. Something that we still have now, and something that's still a focus, access to justice, and even the TLAP program. And it's just amazing.
Thank you.
How much you've contributed to the legal community and just to Memphis in general, to Tennessee, as a matter of fact. You're just amazing.
Well, I'm happy to be here, and I've told people before, I'm from Pittsburgh, but Memphis is my home, and it's where I'm going to stay. I mean, I don't have any intention of leaving. I go back to Pittsburgh, and it's very interesting. It's very different. Even now, there's a big difference between Pittsburgh and Memphis. Although when I first got here, I thought, oh my God, how can I live here? I mean, here's how I lived here. I butted heads with everybody for a while because I was this Yankee that came to Memphis, and it wasn't being done my way. I didn't understand their way. And finally, it dawned on me that I had lived in a foreign country. I lived in France for almost a year, and this was just another foreign country. It was another foreign country.
Different culture.
Different culture. Different language, different culture, different mores, different everything. I lived in a foreign country with a different language completely. I could do this. It's a different country. And once I decided this was a different country, I was fine.
And in your time here, how have you seen Memphis as a city develop or grow?
I love what's going on now in terms of the construction that's happening, because for a long time I really felt that all the other communities in Tennessee were developing. I like the way Memphis is developing. It's not just tearing things down and putting up new stuff. It's adapting things. It's adapting uses. It's the caption that has the William C. Ellis facade. I mean, that's fabulous. It's taking buildings and repurposing them instead of tearing everything down like other places do. I won't say where. But that's what I love about Memphis, is that it respects its heritage. It respects its history. It's not bound by its history. It's not moribund. It's not bound by its history. It respects it, but it builds on it. And that's what I love about this city.
I have a couple questions about some hobbies of yours. First, I don't know if people know, but you are a 6th degree black belt.
Yes.
How long have you been in that?
35 years.
And what got you involved?
I had a friend who thought it would be good for me to go to karate class, and he introduced me to my instructor, who is still my instructor, and it really has become pretty much the foundation for everything I do. It's the concentration and focus it requires, the breathing that you learn. I'm sure you learn it in yoga and other things, but it is what I use to do anything. It's my foundation.
The other hobby I heard about was tap dancing.
That's a funny one. I did a little bit of tap dancing back in the 80s with Jackie Nichols at the Playhouse. And I saw him at a Cocktails for a Cause party. And I said, Jackie, do you ever think about doing any freelance tap classes? And he said, well, I could. So the initial class was Valerie Smith, me, Suzanne Landers, I think Leanne Kleinman was in that. And it was just like a few of us. And we put together a tap class on my first floor, 55 South Main. And that was the first one. And so now we get Jackie sometimes twice a year, usually now once a year. We'll do 9 or 10 classes. And we call it tap dancing for non-dancing adults, okay? So we have fun, and, we go out somewhere afterwards and get a bite to eat, but it's as much social as it is tap dancing. So it's moved on, and now we have other people who are coming in and out. And it's kind of evolved, but it's basically a lot of Jackie's contacts through his nonprofit assistance program that he heads, and so it's fun.
Have you performed anywhere yet?
We don't perform.
Okay.
We don't even have a recital.
It's just for you guys?
Which is for us. Yeah. It's
not even a recital.
It's really tap dancing for a non-dancing adult. Seriously.
But you also ballroom dance.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought so. How long have you been ballroom dancing?
For a while. I mean, the pandemic was one kind of weird portion of it, a little bit before that, but just it was sort of off and on. Just it was also social. A friend of mine got me involved, and we would go there to meet. As an aside, we would dance, and then we would go to dinner. I mean, the whole purpose of getting together was to go to dinner.
To go to dinner. I was going to say, all of it ended in dinner.
Yeah, all of it ended in dinner. So that's the way it started. And so it picked up from there. But yeah.
My final question for you is, looking back over your career, what advice would you give for young lawyers or folks just starting out in the practice of law?
This is a really different climate than it was when I started practicing law. I'll give the same advice that I used to give at swearing-in ceremonies for young lawyers, what we used to do across the state. The only thing you really have that is totally and completely you, and it is precious, is your reputation. Don't lose it. If you lose your reputation, it's not easy to get it back, maybe impossible. Very easy to trip up. Always be open and above board. Always be true to yourself, but be very mindful of what you're doing, how you're doing it, and how you interact with people.
That's good advice.
That's great. I'm glad to hear that even today. It makes you just really think and be mindful as you go along and make all of these thousands of decisions we have to make in a day.
Well, Justice Holder, thank you so much for doing this. We appreciate your time.
Well, thank you. This has been fun.
Good. Till next time.